You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club, World Affairs, and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Until a moment ago, or that's what it feels like, the acronym UNRWA, or more fully, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, wouldn't have sparked immediate recognition in a lot of Americans' eyes. It probably doesn't even now. But the UN organization established to aid Palestinian refugees in the Near East has become yet another flashpoint in the ongoing conflict between Israel and people in Palestinian lands, especially right now in Gaza. The UN agency provides education, healthcare, and other vital services for Palestinians in refugee camps in Israel's neighbors in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. It's run by UN staff. Its employees are, in many cases, Palestinian civilians, whose salaries help drive local economies. For years, the United States cut off funding for UNRWA, which is largely supported by voluntary contributions from member states. Now, with evidence that agency employees played a part in the Hamas assault on Israel in October, the organization is again under a microscope, and American support for its work again in doubt. Joining me now, Kenneth Roth, former executive director of Human Rights Watch and author of the forthcoming Righting Wrongs. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks for having me, Ray. It's good to be with you.
I hope we can start with a quick thumbnail description of the sort of day in and day out of UNRWA, what it does, something that goes a little farther than I did in the intro, just so people begin with an understanding of what we're talking about here.
Okay, well, I think when we talk about UNRWA, we have to talk about UNRWA before October 7th and after October 7th. Before October 7th, it was kind of a classic humanitarian agency that largely provided education, but also other basic public services for Palestinian refugees. That is to say, people whose families were forced out of Israel in 1948 as part of what Palestinians call the Nakba, and were dispersed around the region. And UNRWA operates within Palestine, that is within Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, but also in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, where there are significant Palestinian refugee populations. Now, since October 7th, it's a different story. I think education has basically stopped. Everything has stopped. And for the people in Gaza, at least, it's a matter of basic survival. And UNRWA is by far and away the largest humanitarian agency trying to service 2.3 million Palestinians amidst the Israeli bombardment, the fighting, and the Israeli siege. Now, Gaza was already under a 16-year blockade, but the siege has largely stopped food, water, fuel, electricity, with the exception of kind of drips and drabs of aid that are allowed in on periodic humanitarian convoys. And insofar as that aid gets in, it's UNRWA principally that distributes it. There are other humanitarian groups there. They recently put out a joint statement saying, all of us collectively don't even come close to being able to replicate UNRWA's capacity. So if there is going to be a conscientious effort to address the large-scale starvation, UN experts have said everybody in Gaza is hungry, a quarter of the people are facing starvation, something like 93% of the people in the world facing starvation are in Gaza. If anybody's going to address, that's UNRWA.
Using your framework of before and after October 7th, who were the rank and file staff in the training programs, in the clinics, in the schools, making microloans? Who were these people?
For the most part, they're Palestinians. Now, there is senior leadership that is internationals, but for the most part, UNRWA hires locally. They hire Palestinians. They're actually a major source of employment in Gaza in particular, where there are few employment options. And so they hire local people. And as you would expect, it's Palestinians teaching Palestinians, Palestinians providing health service to Palestinians, Palestinians trying to feed Palestinians. That's what UNRWA is.
Now, this is blockbuster news. The accusation, the evidence presented by Israel that members of UNRWA's staff were involved in the Hamas attacks. What is Israel alleging? What has UNRWA said in response?
Israel's allegation, which they say was based principally on intercepts of mobile phones, was that a dozen UNRWA employees participated in some way in the October 7th Hamas assault on Israel. Now, UNRWA, frankly, responded 100% appropriately. The head of UNRWA immediately said, "That's horrible. We are going to immediately investigate." They suspended 9 of the 12. They said 2 of the 12 were dead already. There's always been a question about what happened to that 12th person. As an institution, distancing itself from any complicity in this horrendous attack of October 7th, UNRWA did exactly the right thing.
And now, you mentioned a dozen people. Out of how many are we talking about?
Well, within Gaza, they employ 12 to 13,000. So it's a tiny percentage of the staff.
Ken, one of the allegations made by the Israelis is that a very large percentage of UNRWA's staff are either complicit or part of Hamas. Can you flesh that out a little more?
They've been walking around a dossier that the Wall Street Journal got a hold of. And they say that 10% of UNRWA's employees are linked to Hamas. That was the term. And it's never clear what linked means. Is a family member part of Hamas? Are they members of Hamas's political side? Because remember, Hamas is not just a military body. It also is a political body, and it runs Gaza. It's very unclear. And this is a big allegation that they've been running around the Israeli government, I think because they recognize that if the issue is just the dozen UNRWA employees who were accused of complicity in the October 7th attacks, UNRWA's kind of taken care of that. Now, one irony in this is that UNRWA's been saying, look, we're not a government. We don't have the capacity to do these kind of intelligence investigations. Once a year, we've been giving Israel a list of our entire staff, and we thought they were vetting. So if they're coming back to us now and saying 10% are Hamas, what were they doing? Why didn't they tell us before? Why are they putting this out now when we're vulnerable and they think they can cut off our funding?
So there needed to be a top-to-bottom examination of who was doing what, but you feel the agency has done its due diligence?
In terms of the particular allegations around October 7th, yes. But I think what we have to recognize is that October 7th was a pretext for the Netanyahu government to try to get rid of UNRWA. And it has hated UNRWA forever. And it saw this as an opportunity. Now, why did it hate UNRWA? Historically, because it saw UNRWA as perpetuating the sense among Palestinian refugees that they are Palestinians. And here it's worth distinguishing between the Palestinian refugees within the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, who obviously today live within Palestine, but their families had homes in what became Israel. And so many of them ideally would like to go back to their ancestral homes in Israel. But then on top of those who at least are within Palestine, there are several million Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. And they are not permitted to return either to Israel or to Palestine. And these refugees too, Israel ideally would like them to forget about being Palestinians. Just become Lebanese, become Jordanian, become Syrian. Just get on with your life. And they view UNRWA, particularly its educational system, as perpetuating this sense among Palestinian refugees that they are Palestinians, and therefore keeping up this desire to return to their ancestral homes. So their view is if they get rid of UNRWA, they get rid of a big part of the Palestinian refugee problem.
Well, setting aside Israel's convenience for a moment, why are these people still living in refugee camps in southern Lebanon, in southwestern Syria, in western Jordan? Why have they not become just a part of the societies where they've been living? That's a long time, 75 years.
The answer is a little bit different in each country. I mean, Lebanon is the worst in terms of not granting Palestinian refugees Lebanese citizenship. Jordan's probably the best, where Palestinians arguably are the majority population within Jordan, and they mostly do have Jordanian citizenship. But even though we use the term refugee for the Palestinians, it's a term that in most other cases has a different meaning. So if you think about what is a refugee, typically they are a person who has fled persecution and is looking for a safe haven in some other country, either permanently, where they would then resettle, or temporarily. If you think about the Ukrainian refugees in Europe, where many of them needed a safe haven for a while, but then they're gradually going back to Ukraine as it seems safer to do that. So most refugees want to stay in their new country, at least for a while. The Palestinian refugees, even though we use the same term, are very different. They actually have no desire to stay in their adopted country. They want to go back. They don't fear active persecution. They're being prevented from going back by Israel. And that's the big difference. And I think the Israeli government hopes that if somehow UNRWA disappeared, these people would stop thinking of themselves as Palestinians. I think that that's naive. There is a kind of a long tradition among Palestinians of keeping the key to the family home and wanting to go back to Israel. Whether that's realistic or not is a separate issue, but that desire among many Palestinian refugees nonetheless persists.
Does Israel have a point to a degree that the nature of the reception of the post-48 inward flows of Palestinians has kept alive this flame of desire to return to Haifa, to the Galilee, to various places that are in today Israel proper, that may be unrealistic?
Well, it's unrealistic insofar as Israel wants to maintain a significant Jewish majority within Israel. So Israel would like to just forget the crimes of 1948, forget the fact that some 600,000 Palestinians at that point were forced from their homes and out of their country. And Israel seems to hope that as time goes on, people will forget that original crime. Now, it's not just the Palestinians who don't forget that original crime, but many of the neighboring countries as well don't forget it.
When you say don't forget it, isn't there an aspect of don't forget it where they use it for their own domestic purposes as well?
Well, obviously, domestically, the Palestinian cause is very popular in the Middle East. And so no government could afford to be indifferent to the Palestinian cause. Most of them endorse a Palestinian state, even the Saudi crown prince, who I think personally could care less about the Palestinians, but he now feels obliged to endorse a Palestinian state as a prerequisite to this normalization of relations that Biden is trying to push. So I think the Palestinian cause is genuinely popular in the region. And governments, even though mostly these are autocracies, dictatorships, monarchies, and the like, they still have to reflect public opinion to some extent. Now, if you look at kind of historically the negotiations, this has been a big sticking point, the so-called right to return. So the issue has been not simply, does Palestine get all of the borders that it had in 1967 before the Israeli occupation started? If there's going to be a trade-off, what is the nature of that trade-off? But a big sticking point historically has been, what happens to the refugees? Do they get to go back to Israel? Do they get to go back even to Palestine? Because it's worth noting that Israel doesn't allow refugees even to return to Palestine, that is to say the West Bank or Gaza or East Jerusalem, because it has actually been gradually creating a so-called one-state reality through its settlements and making the possibility of a second state, a Palestinian state, increasingly remote. If you go to the West Bank, it's just Swiss cheese, these little Palestinian enclaves that remain because of all the settlements and the outposts and the bypass roads. And so the Netanyahu government's policy actually has been to create a one-state reality. But then given that, they don't want the demographic problem of more and more Palestinians. As it is, the land from the river to the sea is roughly 50-50 Jews and Palestinians. And so to even allow Palestinian refugees to return to Palestine, to the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, is seen as anathema to the Israeli government because it recognizes that it's maintaining control of this large population through occupation and arguably through apartheid.
Well, we've been using a 75-year frame to talk about this problem. Let's return to the near-in one of the world after October 7 and the controversy surrounding UNRWA. This is still an agency doing pretty vital work, or I guess arguably even more vital work since the bombardment of the Gaza Strip. Is it able to carry on without American and other allied financing?
The problem is that, first of all, UNRWA has no reserves. You referred to the U.S. having suspended aid. In fact, it was Trump that suspended aid for a while. And because of that, UNRWA used up its reserves. It has no reserves. So it's living hand to mouth. And it has said that by the end of this month, February, it will run out of funds because many other governments followed the U.S. lead and suspended aid. And even though different governments are at different points in the funding cycle, the U.S. actually has given most of the aid in the current fiscal year. But because UNRWA does have a pretty steady flow of funds from governments, many of which have now suspended their aid, it is going to be in deep trouble come the end of this month. And this is not ordinary times. It'd be bad enough if suddenly education and UNRWA healthcare had to stop. But for UNRWA to have to stop feeding people, to stop providing clean water, to stop providing the basics of life at a moment of large-scale famine, that would be horrible. And the German government, sometimes the U.S. government, pretend that others could step in. But as I noted, others can't step in. They're the first to say it. Nobody has the on-the-ground capacity that UNRWA does.
Does Israel risk shooting itself in the foot, having achieved an outcome that it had much hoped for, a hobbled and under pressure UNRWA, the distress of an agency it despises? Are there risks here for Israel that if you had the ear of somebody in the cabinet, you might remind them it seems like they're not thinking through?
They're not thinking through, but I think you also have to recognize that this far-right Netanyahu government has mixed goals, shall we say here. And they're being a bit cagey about what their end game is. So, for example, Netanyahu refuses to talk about the day after the war. He has not articulated what that would look like. And the reason is because his coalition doesn't agree. And two key ministers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who represent 13 seats in the Knesset, Netanyahu has a 64-seat majority in the 120-seat Knesset. They view the end game as basically expelling large numbers of Palestinians and resettling Gaza. That would solve the security problem, even though that would be the massive war crime of forced deportation. And Netanyahu is reluctant to say no to that because if they then quit the coalition, he's out of a job. He is back to facing the corruption, criminal charges that he has been facing. And so when you say, is Israel shooting themselves in the foot? Yes, if they're going to have to take responsibility for feeding 2.3 million Palestinians, but no, if they follow the Ben-Gvir Smotrich plan of just expelling everybody.
Do you think Americans realize how radical Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are? Do you think that people are hearing through the normal channels that they get news about the Middle East that we're talking about a Kahanist, eliminationist, ethnic cleansing leaning faction in the Netanyahu government?
I think people are aware that there are some ultra right-wing, you could almost say wacko ministers in the Netanyahu government. I think people tend to discount it because they say, oh, well, there's still Netanyahu. He's pretty right-wing himself, but we're used to him. He's not going to do something crazy. What they don't appreciate is that Netanyahu is utterly dependent on Smotrich and Ben-Gvir for his political future. And as a result, he has not publicly crossed them. And in the end, when push comes to shove, when he's got to decide what does he do in the end, this is coming up now when the question of does Israel attack Rafah, the southernmost city in Gaza where roughly 1 million Palestinians have congregated. And in this tiny little area, are they going to launch a military assault where the people there have no place left to go? They've already gone from northern Gaza to central Gaza to Khan Yunis to now Rafah. It's all that's left. And the next step is crossing the line into Egypt, which Egypt doesn't want, the U.S. government doesn't want, the Palestinians don't want. But that's what two key ministers in the Netanyahu government want. And unless Netanyahu government, for the first time in his career, puts something first besides himself, he's going to end up going along with that.
Let's talk about the problem this gives, from your point of view, American policymakers. President Biden has been pretty stalwart in his support of the Israeli government in its broadest sense, but also of Prime Minister Netanyahu particularly, at least until the smoke clears and the last shots are fired. Are there risks, are there downsides for the U.S. government in this kind of full-throated backing so far of Israel since October 7th?
Well, Brad, let me put a slight qualification into your characterization there, in that to give Biden credit, he has been outspoken in pushing the Israeli government to take more care not to bomb Palestinian civilians in Gaza and to let in more humanitarian aid to try to alleviate the starvation and the suffering. So at a rhetorical level, he's been quite outspoken, quite good. The problem is he hasn't backed that up with any real force. And the U.S. government has the obvious leverage of the $3.8 billion in annual military assistance that it supplies Israel, the huge amounts of arms that it sells to Israel. Biden refuses to condition, let alone suspend, that aid or those arms on any better behavior by Netanyahu. So it looks to the world that despite the rhetoric, it's empty rhetoric, and that the U.S. is fully supporting the Israeli government. In fact, the U.S. is not even allowing a UN Security Council resolution to go through ordering better behavior. It has dismissed the International Court of Justice decision of plausible genocide by Israel as if somehow that was just a mistake. And so these areas where Biden does have significant leverage, he's not using it. And so coming back to your question, is he at risk? Is the U.S. government at risk? Yes, the U.S. government is at risk because this has engendered enormous animosity around the world. And at a moment where the U.S. government is trying to build support for Ukraine against Putin's invasion, trying to build support for the global contest with China, Biden is losing people left and right around the world. And indeed, within the United States, Biden is at risk of losing the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And with an election coming up, it's not as if they're going to vote for Trump, but they could just not vote, which could have the effect of throwing the election to Trump.
Just the way you answered that question, I think, illustrates the predicament. You were quick to point out that there was nuance and detail and coloration in Biden's support, that it wasn't black and white, binary, yes, no, stop, go. And then, sort of in the fuller context of your answer, made it seem like so far, even for all the implied conditionality, it was pretty binary. Yes, as opposed to no.
Yeah, no, it is. When push comes to shove, the rhetoric has been empty and the support has been unconditional for Netanyahu.
Is there room, given who's in Biden's coalition, given American opinions about Israel, which are very broad-ranging and wide-ranging, is there room for maneuver? Can Biden, for instance, request TV time and go on and explain, look, we have no truck with this Kahanist, ethnic cleansing-based view of Palestinians that can be simply expelled from these areas. That's just not what we're supporting. That's not what we want, and that's not what we're going to pay for. Or is he really boxed in by it being 2024, by our historic commitment to Israel that dates back to the proclamation of the state and the UN declaration and the very beginning of the world body? How much room for maneuver does Joe Biden have?
I think he has much more room than he is trying to exercise so far. Biden has always been much more concerned with attacks from the right than with criticism from the left. I think he feels that people on the left have no place to go, and he's not really taking into account the prospect of just staying home and not voting. I think probably because he figures that people will see that as a de facto vote for Trump, and so they won't do it in the end. But it would be, I think, quite plausible for Biden to say, look, at what happened on October 7th is horrendous. Of course, Israel has a right to defend itself. But atrocities by one side, war crimes by one side, do not justify war crimes by the other. That's why I, Joe Biden, have been pressing the Israeli government to ease up on its bombing so it's not going to be killing so many civilians. That's why I've been pressing them to let in humanitarian aid. They're not listening. And so I've got to start putting some teeth into my words, and I'm doing X, Y, and Z. And the simplest thing would be to start conditioning the aid.
So far, the administration has chosen to speak with general continued support publicly and openly and in front of microphones, while it is reported pressuring the Israelis behind the scenes. Is that good enough? Or is there an aspect of the way international diplomacy is played that almost requires the United States to back up its behind-the-scenes pressure with public denunciations of what Israel is doing?
Well, I mean, Biden has come closer to public denunciations than he has to genuine pressure. So by saying Israel should pay more attention to civilian casualties, Israel should let in more humanitarian aid, that's not the same thing as saying Israel's not doing that these are war crimes to not let in the aid or to bomb civilians. So he's not going that far. But if you think about this conversation between Biden and Netanyahu, which probably doesn't happen that often these days, but I think Netanyahu is just thumbing his nose at Biden because there just are no consequences. And Netanyahu thinks that Biden won't take the political steps that are needed to impose consequences on Israel. And Biden, partly, I think, just through personal inclination, he's very attached to Israel, but partly through political calculation, is so far unwilling to really twist the Israelis' arm. Now, the irony in all of this is that while the U.S. has enormous leverage over Israel, when you look at the rhetoric, of Blinken in particular, the Secretary of State, it's as if the deus ex machina, the solution to all of this, is the Saudi crown prince. And what they talk about is, we're going to get the Saudi crown prince to insist on a Palestinian state, and by implication, not mass deportation, as a condition for normalization of relations. And yes, Israel wants normal relations with Saudi Arabia, but the idea that the Saudi crown prince has more leverage than Joe Biden, the president of the United States, has over Israel is preposterous. But that somehow is, at least judging by public rhetoric, what U.S. strategy is. We're going to use this roundabout method of normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia to get Netanyahu to behave better, rather than exerting the obvious direct pressure and leverage that Washington has.
Well, who else has been behaving as if he has the whip hand, as the British used to say? Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, has proceeded, I don't know whether it's bluff and bluster or a kind of confidence based on past success, that he's the guy who's got all the juice in this triangle, that he can proceed with the United States the way he has and get his way.
I think Netanyahu sees some political mileage out of standing up to the United States, particularly when he says, look, I'm protecting Israeli security. It's a very short-sighted sense of security. And one of the big problems with Netanyahu is that he has an enormous incentive to keep this war going, because there's broad recognition that as soon as the fighting stops, then the political reckoning over responsibility for October 7th begins. And while obviously Hamas bears primary responsibility for those attacks, there was a clear Israeli intelligence failure. And many Israelis blame Netanyahu for taking his eye off the ball, for focusing on trying to undermine the independence of Israel's judiciary, trying to expand the settlements, getting these massive demonstrations against him in Israel, and forgetting about the threat emanating from Gaza. So it is very likely that as soon as the fighting stops, Netanyahu is forced out of office. And as I mentioned, therefore forced to confront the corruption prosecution that he faces.
There's more reporting that there's a possible peace plan in the offing, that there are targets and agreements and dates possible. You talk about the clock starting to tick for Benjamin Netanyahu. Does it start ticking for a different way for Hamas?
I think a lot depends on what the possible resolution is. And while there's much talk in the media about the two parties getting closer to a resolution, they still seem quite far apart, with Hamas insisting on a definitive end to the fighting and a withdrawal of all Israeli troops, and Netanyahu saying, no, we're just going to have a partial, a short-term ceasefire, and the troops are going to stay in place. So that's a very big difference. The fate of the hostages is very much at stake because there is very little likelihood that the hostages are released through fighting. It's much more likely that they be killed. The only realistic prospect is through a negotiation, but that would require Netanyahu prioritizing the lives of the hostages over his own political future. And so far, he's shown little inclination to do that.
Kenneth Roth is the author of the forthcoming Righting Wrongs. He's the former executive director of Human Rights Watch. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground. Great to talk to you.
Thanks for having me, Ray. I enjoyed the conversation.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, and Adam Ailey. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.